Hello, welcome to the Self Learning Platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we are going to start Unit 2 Liberal and Neoliberal Approaches. And our starting point is Theory of Communication. The communications theory in international relations is considered to be an integral part of what has come to be called sociological liberalism strand of thinking. Unlike the realists who view international relations exclusively in terms of the study of relations between the governments of sovereign states, sociological liberals assert that it is also about transnational relations, that is, relations between people, groups, and organizations belonging to different countries. James Rousseau defines transnationalism as the processes whereby international relations conducted by governments have been supplemented by relations among private individuals, groups, and societies that can and do have important consequences for the course of events. As is evident from the above definition, the notion of community and the process of interdependence are considered to be important elements of international relations. The underlying assumption of the communication theory, which builds on the notion of transnationalism, is that as transnational activity increases, people in distant lands get linked and their governments become more interdependent. This leads to a situation whereby it becomes more difficult and a costly proposition for states to act unilaterally and to avoid cooperation with the neighbors. As a result, states not only become wary of the rising cost of war but also work towards the goal of creating a peaceful international community. Carl Dritz is considered to be the chief proponent of the communication theory, or perhaps more appropriately, communications approach in international relations. This approach seeks to measure the extent of communication and transactions between societies by watching the flow of international transactions such as trade, tourist, letters, and immigration. The central argument of the communications approach, as articulated by Datuch, is that a high degree of transnational ties between societies would lead to peaceful relations that would amount to more than the absence of war. Such transactions, the argument goes, will eventually lead to the development of what the Dutch called security communities or integrated socio-political systems. Integration in this context means that a sense of community has been achieved and that people have come to agree that their conflicts and problems can be resolved without resort to large scale physical force. Deutsch identifies two more subcategories of security communities: amalgamated and pluralist. He maintains that both of these are characterized by the absence of intra-community wars. Among the amalgamated security communities, Dutch believes that United States fits the bill since its unified federal structure enables it to exercise central political control over a continent-sized region. Pluralist security communities, on the other hand, lack such central political authority. However, the various national units that together constitute a pluralist security community tend to refrain from fighting one another and thus do not need to fortify their borders. North American continent and Western Europe, respectively, larger areas are believed to be good examples of pluralist security community. From the perspective of the communication approach, integration is viewed both as a process leading towards political unification and as the end product of that process, amalgamated and pluralist security community. The next point is theory of conflict resolution. Liberals are not anonymous on how to resolve conflicts in the international system. There are probably as many divergent approaches to address the issue of conflict in the international system as there are different strands within liberalism. However, what is common to all the strands is the underlying emphasis on the role of human reason and rationality in securing international cooperation, which in turn will help resolve conflict between various state actors. Moreover, it is this community between them which distinguishes the liberals from the realists, who treat conflict as a permanent feature of world politics, while the realists believe that resource to war is a necessary condition for resolving conflicts. Liberals stress that the conflict can be resolved by forging international cooperation without actually resorting to coercive means. Unlike the realists, as noted above, we believe that existence of a hegemonic power is a prerequisite to cooperation. The liberals are of the view that cooperation can be achieved through non-coercive bargaining based on identification of mutual interest. Where the liberals differ from each other is how to go about it. As we might have perhaps already noticed, different strands of liberalism, as discussed above, approach the issue of resolving conflicts differently. We have already seen the views of liberal institutionalists, including the functionalist and neo-functionalist and the communication theorist. In this regard, in the following section, therefore, we shall focus primarily on those strands of liberalism, namely interdependence liberalism and republican liberalism, which we have not covered so far, and see as to how do they approach the issue of resolving conflicts in the international system. This might also help us identify the points of departure of these liberals from the ones already discussed above. How do interdependence liberals seek to resolve conflicts? Such liberals are of the view that a high division of labor in the international economy increases interdependence, that is, mutual dependence between states, which discourages and reduces violent conflicts between them. The emergence of trading states such as Japan and Germany in the post-war period provides strength to the assumption of the interdependence liberalism. The underlying assumption of this trend of liberalism is that such trading states tend to refrain from the international military political option of high military expenditure and instead prefer to focus on the trade options of an intensified international division of labor that increases interdependence. Such an assumption received a tremendous flip in the wake of the end of the Cold War, with the trading option being hugely preferred even by very large states. Reassurance is of the view that end of Cold War has made the traditional military political option less urgent and thus less attractive. The theory of complex interdependence, formulated in the 1970s by Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye, took the logic of interdependence to a new height, distinguishing this version of post-war interdependence from the earlier and simpler kinds of interdependence in which the use of force was always an option in the case of conflicts between the states. These theorists argue that the process of modernization is fast increasing the level and the scope of interdependence between states. Under conditions of complex interdependence, transnational actors are increasingly becoming more important, with the consequence that the military force has become a less useful instrument of policy. As a result, international relations are increasingly becoming more like domestic politics. As Cohen observes, different issues generate different coalition, both within governments and across them, and involve different degrees of conflicts. Politics does not stop at the water's edge. The interdependence liberal thus argue that in most of these conflicts, military force is fast becoming redundant. Other sources of non-military power, like negotiating skills, are increasingly becoming much more important. Cohen and Nye thus argue that the under complex interdependent states are getting more preoccupied with the low politics of welfare and less concerned with high politics of national security, which would eventually pave the way for a world free of all conflicts. Republican liberals approach the issue of conflict via democracy. The underlying assumption is that liberal democracies are better equipped to resolve conflicts and less prone to war, as these are based on the foundation of peaceful existence and rule of law. They therefore argue that democracies are far more law abiding than other political systems. This, however, does not mean that liberal democracies never go to war. As a matter of fact, democracies have gone to war as often as have known democracies. But the underlying argument here is that democracies really fight each other. Republican liberals are therefore generally very optimistic about the role of democracies in establishing long term world peace. The obvious question that arises here is what is it that makes them so very optimistic about the prospects of long term world peace? It may be useful to look at the observation of Sorensen in this regard, who argues that with the increase in the number of democracies in the world in the recent years, the prospects of a more peaceful world has, if anything, brightened up. In such a world, he further argues, international relations will be characterized by cooperation instead of conflict. Michel Doyle perhaps most systematically addresses the question as to why democracies are at peace with one another. He advances three elements to strengthen the claim that democracy leads to peace with other democracies. First, democracies follow democratic norms of peaceful resolution of conflicts. Given the fact that democratic governments are controlled by their citizens who are generally against waging war with other democracies, democratic governments force which lead to the formation of what Kant called a Pacific Union. Union are not in the sense of a formal peaceful treaty, but a zone of peace based on the common moral foundations of all democracies. Such commonalities tend to encourage peaceful ways of resolving conflicts both at the domestic and international level. Thirdly, our increasing economic cooperation and growing interdependence between democracies strengthen international peace and minimizes the chances of conflict. In the Pacific Union, the spirit of commerce, a term coined by Kant, will result in mutual and reciprocal gain for those involved in the international economic cooperation and exchange, eventually rendering the practice of war obsolete. Now let us go to the summary of the unit. What becomes abundantly clear from the foregoing discussion is the fact that liberals do not speak in one homogeneous voice. There are various strands within liberalism, each of which approaches international relations from its own unique vantage point. However, there are certain common underlying themes cutting across different strands that provide a common identity to liberalism as a school of thought in international relations. For example, the underlying emphasis on the role of human reason and rationality in securing international cooperation is common to all the strands of liberalism. Moreover, it is this commonality between them which distinguishes the liberals from the realists who treat conflict as a permanent feature of world politics. While the realists believe that recourse to war is a necessary condition for resolving conflicts, liberals stress that the conflicts cannot be resolved by forging international cooperation without actually resorting to coercive means. Unlike the realities who believe that the existence of a hegemonic power is a prerequisite to cooperation, the liberals are of the view that cooperation can be achieved through non-coercive bargaining based on identification of mutual interest. Now we want to wind up today's lecture and we have come to the end of the unit. Thank you so much for your attention.